It's becoming increasingly fashionable these days to deny the occurrence of the Holocaust. I actually can't make a video on the Second World War without Holocaust deniers flooding the comments to tell me that it's all a lie or that it's some kind of psyop designed to push the conspiracy of a genocide which never happened. So, whether you're an active Holocaust denier who's open to having their worldview challenged, or you're just game to learn a bit of history, we're going to dive into some of the common arguments that folks use to challenge the fact that the Holocaust had happened, and why I think these arguments don't actually stand up to the historical facts. And before you get all uppity at me, this has nothing to do with defending Israel today or modern politics. What this is about is history, and we can't be trying to change the past just because we don't like the way that the world looks today. Oh, and one last thing. Don't be thinking that this somehow makes me anti-free speech. I like free speech very much. I couldn't do this line of work without free speech, and I'll be honest, I am conflicted on the fact that there are 18 countries in the world where a conversation on this topic can lead to jail time, such as in 2006 when David Irving was arrested in Austria for his comments about the Holocaust. I profoundly disagree with David Irving's historical account. Nonetheless, I'm not entirely sure it should have earned him a night in the slammer. However, what many get wrong on freedom of speech is that the real benefit is not in the right to speak, but also in the right to listen, even to those opinions you don't like. And I would implore those of you who don't think that the Holocaust ever happened to exercise that right and listen. With that said, we're going to start with the most extreme claims and then move on to some of the more mild tropes that are becoming more popular in Holocaust denial. Right, so myth one is there's no evidence that the Holocaust ever happened. So this one is quite easy to dismiss, and I don't think that there's actually many people who truly believe this, so we're not going to spend too long here. The short answer is there's lots of evidence, loads and loads, that the Holocaust happened. So much evidence, in fact, and from so many different sources that it would be impossible for one person or organisation to be able to fabricate all of the testimonies, the photographs, the written documents, and the campsites themselves. It's pie in the sky stuff that all of this was made up after the fact to paint some kind of narrative. There's just too much of it out there for all of it to have been fabricated, and a lot of this evidence we will actually cover in today's video, which leads us to myth 2. The only evidence we have of the Holocaust is survivor testimony. Now, this one's a bit more nuanced because we're talking about scrutinising our sources rather than just denying that they exist, and when studying history, that's a step in the right direction. And if this claim were true, then the argument might actually impact our understanding of the Holocaust, because when most people think about the evidence for what happened, they think about books like The Diary of Anne Frank, or If This Is a Man by Primo Levi, or they think of films like The Pianist or Schindler's List. And all of these are either first-person accounts or inspired by first-person accounts, which doesn't seem that compelling by itself. However, our evidence for the Holocaust is nowhere near exhausted just by relying on these sources. We have testimonies from soldiers on both sides of the Allied forces talking about the state of the camps upon their arrival, the emaciated survivors who were left standing, the piles of hurriedly buried corpses, and the gas chambers, some of which had been destroyed in an attempt to hide evidence. A lot of this is also photographed. In fact, the Russians were the first to actually liberate a camp run by the Nazis, and when they sent photographs and footage to their Western allies, they were so shocked at what they saw that they originally dismissed it all as Soviet propaganda. And I think there's something in our nature that makes us think and hope that nothing as awful as this could ever happen, because it's hard for us to imagine people doing this to their fellow creatures. Unfortunately, though, that doesn't mean that it didn't or couldn't, and when the Western Allies eventually started liberating camps on their side of the front, they realised the video evidence sent in by Stalin wasn't propaganda, but grim fact, because they were seeing the exact same sights too. Moving away from photographic evidence and Allied testimony, though, at the Nuremberg trials, we had confessions from several high-ranking officials of the Nazi Party, either acknowledging the existence of a genocidal program or admitting to have directly participated in it. Hermann Goering said he was aware of an extermination program but didn't participate. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, described the gas chambers and the process of extermination in excruciating detail for his audience at Nuremberg. He explained why he did it, that he wasn't ashamed of it, and even gave numbers. At Nuremberg, he said, quote, "I myself exterminated tens of thousands of people. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, we could kill 6,000 people in 24 hours. Then, at his trial in Poland, he would admit, in total, I would say about 2.5 million people were killed under my command in Auschwitz. And if that's not enough for you, let me read you this confession signed by Höss in 1946, which has been preserved by the British National Archives. Quote, I personally arranged, on orders received from Himmler in May 1941, the gassing of 2 million persons between June and July 1941 and the end of 1943, during which time I was commandant of Auschwitz." So no, we don't just have survivor testimony, we also have testimony from Allied soldiers of both sides who liberated the camps, photographic evidence, as well as confessions from both high and low-ranking Nazis. There's also two other types of evidence that we have, but they line up very nicely with myth number 3 and 4, so let's take it from there. Myth 3 is, there's no proof that the Nazis used gas chambers during the Holocaust. Now, here's where things start getting quite specific and spicy. Now, we actually have quite a lot of physical evidence, as well as testimony and all the rest of it, that this happened, because this question came up in a trial in 2000 between David Irving, the guy I mentioned earlier, and a historian named Deborah Lipstadt. The two were basically embroiled in a lawsuit after Lipstadt called Irving a Holocaust denier, and Irving then responded by suing Lipstadt for libel. At the court, the judge asked Lipstadt to provide solid evidence that the Holocaust had occurred, and specifically that the gas chambers were used for this extermination project. A Dutch-Canadian forensic historian named Robert Jan van Pelt was hired to find evidence, physical evidence, that the gas chambers had been used, which he promptly did. This gave us actual forensic evidence by analysing the inner wall of these chambers and finding deposits of cyanide. Van Pelt was able to prove physically that gases like Zyklon B had been used. If you didn't know, Zyklon B basically is cyanide, so when they found the cyanide, they found the Zyklon B, so to speak. Also, the dosage, the concentration of cyanide that they found in the walls showed that it was used for human extermination and not lysing, as some people would like to argue. This was thrown out in the court. In the end, all of David Irving's case was actually thrown out, and off the back of this and other claims, he failed his lawsuit. But if you still aren't convinced, then as we said before, we have countless survivor testimony and admissions at later trials, and we also have documented evidence, including, but not limited to, the Korher report in 1943, which was basically a series of statistics for Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, and in this document there's lists of millions of Jews processed through camps, language which was later admitted to be a euphemism for extermination. We also have construction blueprints for Auschwitz and Majdanek, which do survive, showing gas-tight doors, fake shower fittings, and ventilation systems. And we have invoices for Zyklon B shipments to Auschwitz, far exceeding any delousing needs, even for a large prison population. In other words, the evidence is out there, and you would have to show that all of these have been fabricated or are in some way compromised in order to confidently deny the fact that gas was used during the Holocaust. And even if you did managed to prove all this, according to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, just under half of all deaths from the Holocaust can be attributed to gassing. So you've still got 3 million people that were systematically murdered in other ways to deal with before you can say the Holocaust didn't exist. Now, I know that you lot hate that 6 million dead number, and we'll get to that later, but for now, let's look at our next myth, because it involves more documentary evidence. Myth 4. there was no master plan for Jewish annihilation. So this myth kind of changes shape depending on who's making the case, but the general line of argumentation is that the Holocaust was not a premeditated plan to exterminate the Jews, but instead a kind of chaotic, feverish nightmare in which the Nazis kind of accidentally ended up exterminating Jews rather than setting out to do so from the beginning. And this is also a myth. From as early as 1919, Hitler was already talking about removing the Jews from Europe entirely. Through the 20s and 30s, his rhetoric only got more extreme, and once in power, anti-Jewish laws and exclusions quickly gave way to outright mass murder. In 1939, after warning that war would mean the annihilation of Europe's Jews, his regime began forced ghettoization. By mid-1941, orders from the top, Himmler, Göring, Heydrich and Eichmann, made the plan much more explicit. Physical extermination. Survivors and perpetrators alike testified to this after the war. Eichmann recalled Heydrich telling him in 1941 that, quote, "The Führer has ordered the physical extermination of the Jews." Rudolf Höss said Himmler personally chose Auschwitz for that purpose, and the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 was where Nazi leaders discussed killing methods and coordination openly. Hitler himself publicly promised the annihilation of the Jewish race on multiple occasions. So the demand for a neat master plan document for there to be proof is kind of a bad faith trick. The evidence is overwhelming, scattered across speeches, orders, testimonies, and the ruins of the killing sites themselves. And I would implore you to investigate the Wannsee Conference yourself to see that this was planned from the top down, premeditated, and deliberate. Now, for our last and most popular statement that I see floating around the internet is myth number 5. The 6 million number is an exaggeration. Now, although this is the most mild of the claims, it is the one that I see the most, and people often make the claim that this number, 6 million, is just way too high. And I'll be honest, I can see why. It's a staggering number, especially when you consider that the Holocaust transitioned from this persecution phase to its murder phase in mid-1941, which means that in just 3.5 years, they exterminated 6 million people. That's around 4,700 people per day, or 200 an hour, or 3 a minute, 1 every 20 seconds, basically. It's an unthinkable scale. But it's quite possible, and that maybe is the scariest part about denying the truth of the Holocaust. We can forget just how nasty we can be when the nation is brainwashed by extremism. Historians know that roughly 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust by comparing pre- and post-war census data. For instance, in Poland there were 3.3 million Jews in 1939. After the war, just 400,000. There's nearly half of your 6 million right there. By studying surviving Nazi records like transport lists, camp registers, and Einsatzgruppen reports, they've been able to get a decent picture of how the deaths were distributed. It's true that some of these records were destroyed towards the end of the war in a deliberate attempt to bury evidence, but enough still exists for us to be able to cross-reference them and get a decent shape of how things went down. But that does still leave a difficult question, and that is, how did they do it? I mean, it's a monstrous number. But the Holocaust was in many ways not just a monstrous act, but a monstrous machine. It was death on an industrial scale. That's kind of what's so haunting about it. Now, I never thought that I would have to show my working out for how a genocide happens, but if this is what it takes to get people to drop the myth that 6 million is an exaggeration, then so be it. So the Einsatzgruppen, which were kind of like a death squad, really, were able to put 1.5 million Eastern European Jews to death as they followed behind the Wehrmacht's thrust eastwards. That's about a quarter of the 6 million, and we have good records for this happening. Another quarter, around 1.5 million, perished to hunger, exposure, and disease, both in the camps and the ghettos. That might seem like a high number to you, it certainly did to me, but there was about 1,000 ghettos in Nazi Europe and another 1,000 concentration camps. Only 6 of those camps were explicitly death camps, which is where most people perished, but we'll get to those in a bit. So, I was in Poland a few years ago during the end of winter, and I was staying in what was once the Jewish ghetto in Krakow. It was cold outside, so cold that I couldn't actually use my phone because the coordination in my fingers wasn't working properly. And I don't really mind the cold. So you don't need to be a genius to imagine it being the dead of winter and you're an 11-year-old child or an 80-year-old woman and your winter clothes have been confiscated. There's an embargo, so you can't heat your own home, and it's been days since you last had a meal. Obviously, you would be extremely vulnerable to disease, starvation, or exposure. When you think there's thousands of ghettos and camps, each crammed to the brim with starving and weakened people, then that number of 1.5 million dying from starvation or illness over 3 whole years seems quite possible. In fact, you might argue that it's expected once you throw in the squalid living quarters and the forced labour. And if you do the maths, it's actually deceptively low. Across 1,000 ghettos and 1,000 camps, 1.5 million died over 3 years, which means each location saw 750 deaths or 250 deaths a year. That's less than 1 death per day. Small increments, but on a scale like the Holocaust, it quickly adds up. Now, that leaves us with the last half, the victims who were exterminated with gas. If we just look at Auschwitz and ignore the other 5 death camps, we can see that it's perfectly possible to hit that number. At its height in 1943, Auschwitz was exterminating 6,000 people a day. It had anywhere between 10 to 14 operational gas chambers at any given time, each capable of housing 2,000 people for a single gassing. It also had up to 150 crematoria ovens. Each cycle took 1 to 2 hours, so 6,000 people a day is then working under capacity. Logistical issues like actually getting the victims to Auschwitz in the first place or procuring enough Zyklon B were the major bottlenecks, not the capacity or the infrastructure in the camps themselves. Conservative cross-checked numbers exist. Deportation records, camp registers, and Nazi memos all converge. And we have proof of all of this too, by the way, through the physical infrastructure which proves capacity, eyewitnesses which confirm procedure, survivor and perpetrators who gave consistent testimony. And of course Rudolf Höss, who we mentioned earlier, who admitted on trial for his life that he killed millions. Very hard to dismiss. Now, bear in mind there were 5 other death camps and 3 whole years of genocide. All of a sudden, 6 million seems almost low. And that's because it was. Most historians believe that once you account for Polish prisoners, Roma people, political dissidents, and the endless list of other so-called undesirables of the Nazi regime, the real number is between 11 and 17 million people. A genocide that spilled out far beyond its intended target. By denying this fact of history, backed with so much evidence, we do 2 things to ourselves and each other. Firstly, we show an unbelievable callousness to the people who both survived and died during this tragedy. But perhaps most importantly is the second problem, which is that by denying it, we make it more likely that this sort of thing could happen again. Now, history shouldn't exist to shame anyone who's alive right now. I don't imagine anybody watching this video was even born when this stuff was happening, let alone was able to participate in it. That's not the point of history, to make you feel bad. Instead, history teaches us about the past and gives us a kind of toolkit to make a better future for ourselves and each other. And this is a lesson that we're never going to learn until we're able to live with our darkest moments, no matter how inconvenient they may be for us.